Welcome to the Social Media Church podcast. I'm Neil Smith, joined by my co-host Aaron Magnuson. And
What's up, everybody?
Today we are talking about podcasting on our podcast. That's my dad joke of the morning.
Nice.
Podcasting on our podcast. We love podcasting, Aaron. We love talking about podcasting. And podcasting is not just something that podcasters should do. It's something that churches should do.
Yeah.
And it's not just one podcast. And so I think we want to dig into the opportunities around podcasting. Aaron, where do we start in the world of podcasting?
It's interesting how long that we've been talking about this. And Nils, to your day, I'm going to answer that in a second, but true to form, I'm going to throw a question back on you after you threw a question on me. When was the first podcast? Like, when did Serial start doing podcasting? The first true podcast that you can remember was in about what year?
Oh gosh, I mean,
pre-2010. Was podcasting, because this podcast started in 2013. That feels super early to me. But the reality is podcasts were happening before even 2013. Over a decade ago, podcasts and the medium of podcasting was happening. I mean, pre 2010.
I'll tell you my first podcast.
Okay.
I'll tell you actually the first one I did too, which is hilarious. I was trying to find a recording of this the other day. So the first podcast that I consumed was a podcast called, or it was, maybe it was like podcasting for you or youth, simply youth ministry podcast. It was Doug Fields, the youth pastor at Saddleback at the time.
No way.
And his crew, the guys that were always on there. But it was basically it was my community of youth pastors that it's like, wow. Oh, these guys, I resonate with these guys. They're in the trenches with me. And this was probably, it was 15 years ago that I was a youth pastor. I'm trying to even think. So that was, I can't even do the math that far back.
15 years ago. Yeah, that's pre 2010.
Yeah, pre 2010. So probably 2006, 2007.
Wow.
And it was not. There was no. I don't think there was Apple. It was iTunes back then, is what I listened to it on. So iTunes.
Yeah, that's true. Where would it have even been posted?
Yeah, so it was just iTunes, and that's where I first consumed podcasts. And then I started a podcast for my youth group. So I was the youth pastor. It was called the Pulse Podcast because we called our youth ministry the Pulse Student Ministries. And this is what you're going to love this, Aaron.
Yeah.
I did it live. We weren't complicated. We actually did it in GarageBand, but
nice.
With no microphone, just basically on my MacBook, the microphone built into the MacBook. We just put it in the middle of a table, and I would do the intro music on my guitar for the Pulse podcast. And I would just make it up, and I would just be strumming. I knew 2 chords, and it was a joke. But it would just be welcome to the Pulse podcast. This is awesome. You should listen. That was my first podcast.
Can you or can you not play guitar?
So here's the thing with youth ministry. When I get into youth ministry, I thought we needed worship to do youth group because that's what I knew. And so the first time I've played a CD, because I didn't have a worship leader. It was me and 3 kids. And so I played a CD and I'm like, this is so bad. I have to learn how to play guitar. So I learned my 3 chords, G, C, and D. So I can play Lord, I Lift Your Name on High and whatever other worship songs there were at the time. And then I realized then you got to sing. And I'm such a bad singer. The CD, as cheesy as that is better than me playing guitar and singing. So I learned enough guitar to play Lord, I Lift Your Name on High. And a couple songs to try to pick up girls, and that didn't work very well either. Katie was not attracted to my guitar playing, to be clear. So I know enough to play some early days. Lord, I Lift Your Name on High, and Our God is an Awesome God.
Okay, so you're a better. You know more about playing guitar than I do. So the answer is yes. You can play. So it wasn't like you were just randomly hacking at the guitar when you were singing your intro. Your little podcast intro. That is incredible. We need to dig that up.
If somebody can find it, I would love.
Yeah, I don't know where that. Yeah, if somebody's listening that worked with Nils back in the day that would know where that is, that's incredible. The reason that I asked that, one, was to extract some unknown gold from you. And if you're not watching on YouTube, I've never seen Nils's smile. He like so giddy talking about his first podcast, or sheepish. I don't know which one, but um, this conversation's been happening for a long time. And if you are old enough, because I'm assuming we have some people who are old enough to remember, listening to the radio, like listening to shows on the radio before even, mainstream television, or before television sets were even in the house. I realize for some of our audience, they have no idea what was just talked about right there. They have TVs in their pockets. But podcasting and audio has been around for a long time. And Nils and I most recently have been talking about you need a podcast for at least 5 years. Like, hey, the sermon podcast is not enough. You need to maybe create something midweek that's what we would refer to as podcast first podcast and podcast content. And so, yeah, where do you get started? I mean, I think it's identifying what you're passionate about talking about. You, pastor, or pastor's team, I'm sure, listen to podcasts. Well, you're listening to this one, so you at least listen to one podcast. But you know that there's many different forms of podcasts. It doesn't have to be two people talking about stuff they claim to be the expert on. That's me poking a little bit of fun at us. But it can also be something shorter form, maybe 1 to 2 minute devotional thought. Maybe it's a daily podcast. Maybe it's endless, but finding something that doesn't work to talk about in the pulpit, but that you feel like God has put inside you, or you feel like God's put this inside your leader to talk about, and creating and opening another space during the week to record content that's going to benefit, not only help that message come out, but also benefit the listeners of that podcast. And I think, Nils, that's where you start. I'd be curious if there's something else that you were getting at with that question, or a way you want to encourage people to start. But I think that's what you have to identify, because if you're just trying to do what Tim Ross is doing, or you're just trying to do what Mike Todd's doing, or you're trying to, do something or do what Gary Vee's doing, or something outside of the space, and you're trying to be the Christian, this or that, it doesn't work if it's not true to you. I think that's important. It doesn't work if it's not true to you, just like any other content.
Yeah. I think you've got to find your flow. But I think the first step to finding your flow is just even getting your sermon content distributed on a podcast first, because you're already creating that content. And I feel like I see so many ministries missing the boat with that. And so, and I say missing the boat.
Just to be clear, you're talking about taking the sermon that's already been recorded and not posting it as a podcast. You're still seeing churches missing the mark on that?
Yes.
My mind is blown. My mind is blown.
So here's
that better not be our audience, Nils. I'm going to start coming after people if it's our audience.
I think it probably is, because I think here's what I think is also happening is they just like have it on their website and they call it a podcast. But most people are consuming podcasts. 70% of podcasts are consumed on Apple Podcasts. And so you've got to make sure you're using that RSS feed and getting it onto Apple Podcasts. Also, there's 30% that aren't on Apple Podcasts that are listening on Spotify, or they're listening on Stitcher, or they're listening on all the other Android platforms that people listen to podcasts on.
Don't say that with such hate. Don't say that with such hate, Nils.
It's confusing. Apple, at the end of the day, I wish I could go to the other side. I am stuck on.
I was on the other side. Yeah,
that's easier. And so it is easier just to be on Apple, but I think that's a miss of, like, if you're just on Apple, there's a lot of people that are missing your content, and we're still in a land grab moment with podcasting, where I think podcasting is here for the long haul, and we're developing our consumption habits. And so we have the opportunity to find new people. And speaking of, I got to tell you this quick story. I was talking to a friend in Vegas this last week, and he was like, hey, my friend was telling me that they're thinking about moving to New York City, and they found this great podcast, and they made the connection that it's my wife and I's podcast that they just randomly found on Apple Podcast. And this is a story, Aaron, we hear all the time. My wife and I do a podcast about New York City, And
Promote it, Nils. Let's go. What's it called so the people can find it? Everybody's trying to move to New York.
coming to New York City, and we
Yes.
tell our story of moving to New York City, and then my wife loves this city and loves helping people move here or visit here. So if you're looking for tips about New York City, that
Guys,
podcast
it's
is
legit.
listen.
It's legit where strangers are coming up to Nils like this. I found this great podcast, and they have no idea until mid-sentence that they're talking to the co-host of that podcast, Nils
So
Smith.
it's
Legit.
it's crazy the people that find us through this podcast, and that's the thing about like churches. I'm like, you can be doing the same thing in your local community. So that said, Aaron, I think start with your sermon. Make sure you're distributing it effectively. If you're not doing that, you don't need to have a second podcast before your first podcast is distributed well. Now, I do think your second podcast can do better than your first podcast.
Agreed.
And I think this is where, and I'd love to just brainstorm ideas here, Aaron, is if you're a pastor, a local pastor, and you're creating a second podcast, what do you do it under the church's name? Do you do it under your name? Do you give it a whole different brand? Like what kind of podcast would you create with the end goal of getting more people to come to your church and engage and participate in your church?
Yeah, I think you need to know. I'm going to initially answer that. How to break it up and where it lives. You need to know. If you're not the lead pastor, you need to lean into your lead pastor and figure out what that is. If you are the lead pastor, you need to lean into God and understand what He's called you to. Do you need your own? And I don't want to. Do you need your own ministry? And I'm not saying that you leave the church and you go do your own thing. There are plenty of successful pastors that Nils more so has worked with, but that we've both worked with that have beautifully married those two things. But in terms of like where it's broken up and what you call it and who owns it, you do have to think about those things. You need to be responsible with how you think about those things. Nils and I cannot answer that for you. That's something you need to, go before God and figure out for yourself. And if you're under your leader, so basically anybody who's not the lead pastor listening to this, you are also called by God to honor your leader and figure that out and help strategize for he or she what that is. And so you don't get to decide that for them. They need to decide that. And by the way, there's paths forward on both sides. So it doesn't really matter. Neither side is a blocker. And that's probably what's most important in this conversation. There isn't a good reason to not have another vein of content. If you're listening to our podcast and if you're producing content that's going out on the internet, there isn't a good reason to not produce another stream of content, which is, in this case, we're talking about a podcast. Now, as far as what that is, Nils, I thought something interesting that just popped into my head. I don't know why I hadn't thought about this before. You remember back in the day when we used to encourage leaders to write a blog post about like the top things to do in their city, or create content that's about your city and your community to go out. That's not just about your church, but it benefits the community at large. I was just thinking about the Coming to New York City podcast and thinking about like, I don't care. Look, if it helps you get it across the line, rip the name. Coming to, I can't imagine coming to Albany, Oregon. I don't think anybody's searching that. I also wouldn't do something overly hacky of like, what are people searching? Don't get bogged down by that. You need to create what's true to you. It's going to find the right audience. Be responsible with, when that audience comes to you. But create a podcast maybe that's for the city. And there could be a really interesting opportunity for who you could have on that podcast, for who you could be talking about, but creating content that is, maybe benefiting people that are trying to come there, but it's also benefiting the people who do live there currently and the voices and the leaders and the people that are there. I've never had that thought before about doing a podcast, but I think that'd be really interesting, especially if you're a pastor that is hyper localized and focused of like, I really want to reach my neighbors. And I do think, Nils, in our last episode, we were talking about short form vertical video, worth listening to, more than worth listening to, actually really important based on what we're talking about, creating another stream of pillar content, which everything we're talking about here should be vertical video as well. But you were talking about TikTok really leaning into being hyper localized.
Yeah.
And I just think about the opportunity that we have where people are craving that. And it does seem to be like, we're going to get the world great. And the internet connected the world. And now it's like this pendulum swinging back to localized. Well, let's start thinking about localized content in shepherding our people. And it could be episodes that are as, surface level as, the best things to do or the best restaurants to go to, whatever. But it could be more, below the surface as well of like, this is what our city's facing right now. And these are some of the leaders that are helping us figure out this, maybe financial crisis in our city, or this construction or this legislation is being passed with our local government, or, and I hesitate to bring politics into it, but whatever those topics would be where they need a pastor speaking into, how do I engage with my, the local schools or, some of those things. So that's something that's never entered my head, but I am curious, Nils, like, and I don't think I've ever given that advice to anybody of like, yeah, this is what you should create your podcast around. But I'm wondering what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my initial thought was it's something similar to like what Transformation Church did with the Dig podcast, where they dug into the sermon, or something where it's like, look, a lot of pastors are really into apologetics, or they're into, marriage, and they create a marriage podcast. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I don't know that really reaches their local community as much as we're processing this. I'm like, that's actually a genius strategy of like doing a for Albany podcast that literally like interview politicians, interview local business leaders, interview local nonprofit leaders, and it's not
other pastors. Interview other pastors in your city, the one you hate that's across the street from you. Interview that lady or that guy, right? Yeah. Like
we don't say the H word in this house, Aaron.
We don't say hate?
Yes.
Okay. That's I was using the other H word. I was being honest. So I know, but I'm with you on that, Nils. But also, like, what better way to stop some of those feelings 100%. Than realizing, guys, the internet's too big. We're all in this together. We need all, and the work. Nils and I were just able to hang out with some Australians at the Dunham and Company conference summit. Excuse me, I call it a conference. It's my thing. Is a summit, but. Guys, the post-Christian world looks a lot different, where churches are fighting for each other, not against each other, for each other, because all we have is all we got. Yes. And so what better way to start leaning into that than interviewing other pastors, or like, how are we doing this together, strategizing and leveraging the podcast for relational equity? Forget who finds it. There's some beautiful stuff that happens just recording content together.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I love it. And this is, I was at a conference that I've mentioned a couple of times here in Las Vegas, where there was this content day, and one of the sessions was all about podcasting for businesses. And they talked about one of the primary things to do to use your podcast is not actually even for the broadcast. It's actually an excuse to talk to other business leaders that here's a way to like break an ice. And because sometimes you're like, hey, can I get 15 minutes with you? Can I get a coffee with you? And it's like, well, why? What are you going to be selling me? Well, can I have you on my podcast? It's like, okay, it feels like the ultimate olive branch. And so this is, I think, man, I love this. Like, I thought we were going to brainstorm lots of different ideas. I think we just found a sweet spot idea that every church should be doing. And honestly, Aaron, as I think about the Coming New York City podcast, we hint at being a part of Hillsong Church, and we've probably brought a dozen people to church with us through the podcast, because they've often said, hey, can I meet you at church? I don't want to go alone. And they know, we don't talk about it a ton, but they know we go to Hillsong Church. I think about Granger Community Church I think they're in Indiana. My friend Kim Meyer used to be their communications director. And I remember going up there and meeting her, and her showing us this magazine they did quarterly for their community.
That's what I was thinking of.
This was something that they made for their community. The church invested in it, printed it, resourced it, and it was a gift to the community. This is the 2023 version of that magazine, of produce a show that isn't all about your church, but is all about your community, and it becomes a natural front door for your church. And you don't have to be overt in promoting your church. You should probably not even talk, very significantly about the church, because they're going to build a relationship with you.
That's right.
While hearing about your church, and maybe your pastor hosts it, maybe he doesn't or she doesn't. Um, but yeah, I think creating
That's
a
really
show
important,
for your
Nils.
community.
Yeah, a show for the community. That's really important what you just said, because you didn't have to tell anybody that you're a part of Coming to New York City podcast, nor on the podcast did you have to say, "Hey, I'm Nils Smith that does all this stuff." That, guys, we live in a day of search,
Yeah,
and there's not a lot of times this is highlighted by the stuff we no longer want to be connected to, that we couldn't outrun because we're digitally connected to it. Right? The same thing happens in a positive way where you don't have to tell them. Guess what? They're going to search. Who the heck is doing a podcast about Albany, Oregon? I was also laughing at that. Guess what? It has very little competition when it comes to SEO. A podcast on your city. Unless you live in New York, right? Unless you live in Dallas, unless you live in Los Angeles, nobody's doing a podcast on your city. Nobody. Nobody's doing an Albany, Oregon, podcast, guaranteed. So the competition there is very little. But in thinking about how you're talking, you don't need to say you're the pastor of blah blah blah. You use your name. Maybe for the first time in your life, disassociate it from pastor. Use your name. Put it out there. They're going to Google search you if it's worth its weight. And then they're going to, oh, this guy's also a pastor, right? There's some natural connection where you don't have to evangelize yourself, which can be very distasteful, especially to this generation. They're going to search for it anyways. And if you're posting it where these pieces of content, the short form vertical video, like we talked about in the last episode, if some of these things are being put together all on one social media, they're going to find it anyways in some of that the crossover community. So yeah, I think that's important, Nils, that you talked about. You don't have to call yourself a pastor. It's not hosted by Pastor John, right? Like it's hosted by, your full name.
Yeah, I love it. I think, Aaron, this is not where I expected this podcast to go, but I think we landed exactly where it needed to go.
Yeah.
And I think, I can't wait to see how ministry leaders take this idea and concept and apply it to their local context. Because I think we just unlocked a strategy that's going to be game changing for several churches. I'm just thinking church plants, mega church,
totally.
mid-sized churches, older churches, newer churches. This is really, I think, a great idea that is not a small lift, but I think will be a fruitful return on your time and energy investment. And I think there's just so many fruits too, beyond just potentially new people coming to your church. There's relationship fruits. There's so much that I think could come out of this idea that the ROI, I have a hard time picturing a better ROI for a pastor other than investing in their sermon. I think at the end of the day, too many pastors don't prioritize their sermon, which I think is so key. Make sure you're preaching a great sermon and shepherd your flock well. But as you're looking for new opportunities to reach new people, I think we just unlocked a really.
If Nils Smith is signing off on this idea, I'm going to lean into it. I got two more thoughts. I'm excited that Nils thought this was a good idea. I've never thought about this before either. So this is this is not where either of us expected this to go. I've not been sitting on this waiting for it to come out, like I have, and I need to plug this. Like I have, this is a complete side, but I need to throw it out there. The NFL is doing flag football for their All-Star game this year.
Okay. Yeah.
I made a video on YouTube. You can find it over a decade ago in 2013 that said the NFL should shift to doing flag football because nobody watches and no players want to play in another contact thing. So I say all that to say sometimes I have good ideas, and I've been waiting to put that out there. This was not one of them. This was a good idea. This is not one that I've been sitting on for a long time, being like, gosh, why are pastors not doing this? I thought about it in this moment. But two things, if you're still not convinced why you should do this. No other organization in your city is equipped to record content like this. You're probably recording your sermons, you're broadcasting, you're doing something no other organization is equipped to then capture for a city-wide podcast. Also, the motivation for reaching your city and benefiting your city and seeing fruit come to your city. No other business has the motivation that we have as Christ followers. So that would be the first thing. And then I would say, The second thing is I would want you to, record this in a way that, is going to benefit the city, but also that can feel like a heavy lift. And so I would be remiss if Nils and I didn't talk about our team that produces our podcast all the time. I think people think Nils and I record our own content. We write our own copy. We send out our own emails. The truth is we don't. We have a team that does it. It's Amplify Social Media. You can Google it. And our team can actually help you do this heavy lift of adding another piece of content. We can chunk up the content for you, create that vertical video. We missed it on the last episode, Nils. We should have talked about Amplify. Nils and I are terrible at selling the really secret sauce things that we have, but it advances the kingdom. And so if you're in a position where you're like, yep, we could record this, we could do this, I just don't know that we have the people to edit it. I just don't know that we have the people to post it where it needs to go. Or maybe you're not posting your sermons. You have no idea how to do that. You don't want to do that, but you want it to go out. Our team can help you with your sermons being posted online as well. So that's amplifysocial.media. You can go there, find out all about our team, and that would be a great opportunity for you. Don't let anything stop you from creating the extra content that's going to benefit you, your church, and your city.
I love it. Thanks for mentioning that, Aaron. I'm with you. I forget to talk about it, and it is. I think at the end of the day,
it's literally the play that they run, and they've been running for years, guys.
And we
years.
built this for ministry leaders.
Yes.
So that because there's strategies we put out there, and they're like, I just don't have the team to do that, the capacity to do that. And at the end of the day, we want to take every excuse away of like, if you've got the team, great, go. Like, we want to give you the ideas, the strategy, everything. If you don't, we want to come alongside you and help you. I want to give one last point to the production of the podcast. Is we often think audio, and we at this point in day and stage of podcast, you need to be capturing video when at all possible as well, both for the clips and the vertical video from our last episode. If you listen to that, if you haven't, you need to go listen to that last episode. Is getting vertical video for or getting video for the clips, but then also for distribution. Is the second largest podcast consumption platform is YouTube today. Right. And so we need to, whenever possible, be getting video for that to be distributed to YouTube as well. So don't miss that opportunity when you're producing your next podcast. This is a great conversation, Aaron. I appreciate you taking us in a new direction, and I'm excited to see what comes of it. If you have any questions about this episode, or we're going to have show notes to everything on our website at socialmedia.church. So go there. We would love for you to follow us on social media. And so the conversation doesn't stop here. It continues on social media. So follow Aaron and I on social media, or follow the Social Media Church channels. You can find all of that on socialmedia.church. And we look forward to connecting with you online and talking to you again on our next episode. Thanks for listening.